Good evening. Tonight we have a special segment called Let's Talk. Our reporters have been gathering information on the effects of violence on student learning. This issue has continued to gain national, regional and global attention. Further, from the various perspectives, namely philosophical, psychological, health and family life, education and sociological, it is seen that student learning is hindered due to some sort of violence in the school. We now go to the various reporters to hear what they have to say.
We begin our discussion with a definition of school violence. This can be defined as any violence which involves school children and occurs on a school property, on the way to school, or school-sponsored events, or during a school-sponsored event. It commonly includes violent acts such as fighting.
According to a study done by Oshako in 1997, school violence and its impact on student learning is an extremely important issue throughout the world, which must be addressed because education is a fundamental right of each and every child. School is crucial for children's development as it provides a space for them to develop their creative talents, critical thinking, gain life skills, and develop social relations while growing with dignity, confidence, and self-esteem as individuals. Schools are supposed to offer children the opportunities to learn and internalize values of solidarity, tolerance, and respect while serving as advocates for the promotion of non-violence. Further studies done by UNICEF and UNESCO clearly reveal, however, that violence is occurring at an alarmingly high rate in developed and more so in developing countries, and its impact on schooling, learning, and living is very serious. Violence or the threat of violence can be such that families feel pressured to keep their children out of school and to encourage school abandonment as a means of preventing further violence and harm. As a result, educational opportunity with all its benefits for the individual and society may be seriously hampered. The most overwhelming reason is the fact that as teachers of students from underprivileged communities, we are all affected by this problem. While it may be difficult to admit that violence exists in schools, which are traditionally places of learning and growth, it can only be controlled by firstly acknowledging its existence, then putting measures in place to manage the problem. For too long, school violence has been ignored in spite of the reality of its alarming increase in society and schools, with devastating results on all areas of society. Violence in schools can seriously hamper children's rights, as a 2012 UNESCO report revealed that children who study in a violent environment tend to achieve lower academic results than those who do not. Violence in schools must be addressed because it is costly, not only in financial terms, but also in terms of long-term damage it inflicts on the individual's healthy personality growth and development. Just take a look at these statistics to understand the true extent of the proliferation of violence in schools locally, regionally, and internationally. Carty-Hart indicated that in 2006, a Trinidad and Tobago youth survey revealed that 35% of students do not feel safe at school, while 21% have been threatened or injured with a weapon on school property in the prior 12 months. And 12% had not gone to school in the prior 30 days because of feeling unsafe there. Jamaica, that has the highest school violence in the region, reported over 915 fights. Internationally, a study done in 2013 by Burdock and Will reported that 7.8% of 9 to 12 graders engage in physical fights on school property.
We would now introduce the philosophical perspective. A philosophy of education is a statement or set of statements that identifies and clarifies the beliefs, values, and understanding of an individual or group with respect to education. A philosophy of education has a lot of power. It defines and directs the focus and objectives of a school. It drives the school attitude and response to such issues as school violence. It is imperative to have a philosophy which holds zero tolerance, which seeks immediate redress for victims, and which finds a way to reintegrate the perpetrator into the school society.
Trinidad and Tobago's national philosophy of education states that ethical and moral concerns are central to human development and survival. Education should be responsive to and stimulate the searing human spirit and the emphatic quest for human communication, interaction, love, and trust.
We follow the philosophy of education put forward by CXC, which promotes the UNESCO imperatives for learning in the 21st century. Focuses on learning to live together and deals with areas such as conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is essential in decreasing the amount of violence in our nation's schools. The decision to cultivate these skills as a formal part of the philosophy of education reflects that the region has a vested interest in reducing school violence. Globally, the philosophies of education are inconsistent when it applies to violence in schools. In the US, even though there are 3 types of student-centered philosophies, they adhere mainly to progressivism, which focuses on developing the student's moral compass. Ironically, because each state has its own interpretation of the laws, the approach to dealing with school violence is fragmented. As such, the incidence of school violence is startlingly high. As teachers, it is of great interest to note that the philosophy of education which governs our actions has such power in the curbing of violence in our schools.
Let us now examine why school violence is such a significant issue that affects students' learning from a psychological perspective. Educational psychologists study how learning is manifested in the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains of the brain, and thus can pinpoint exactly how learning is affected by an issue such as violence. The exposure to violence in the student's home and community at a young age leaves an impression in their developing minds that this is in fact normal behavior. According to Magaha-Garnett 2008, students transfer these violent behaviors such as fighting, bullying, punching, slapping, and kicking to students at the school. This results in both perpetrator and victim suffering consequences. Problems such as difficulty concentrating, increased stress, insomnia, and poor academic performance arises, which according to psychologists Debellis and Delaney Black hamper student learning. The perpetrator's learning is affected as they will face the consequences of their action as stipulated by the Ministry of Education's National School Code of Conduct and Behavior. They will spend more time out of school through suspensions and most likely will return with the same behaviors. The victim is also affected since they are afraid the incident will repeat itself and focus on this rather than their education. Due to the extent of their injuries, they may be hospitalized and thus spend time recuperating away from the classroom where learning should be taking place. What about educators? They too are affected since they cannot deliver the curriculum whilst dealing with violent transgressions. This affects their students since time is spent focusing on diffusing fights rather than on academic learning and their curriculum.
Let us take a look at the HFLE perspective, which allows us as teachers to analyze violence in underprivileged schools and its impact on student learning. Take a moment and examine an all too common school scenario where student learning could be hindered because of a potential fight that could disrupt an entire school if positive choices and interventions are not made by the perpetrator, the victim, and the teacher. The HFLE perspective is important because it sensitizes teachers to the negative emotional, mental, and social impacts of unsafe, unhealthy, and unsupportive learning environments on student learning. Berg et al. 2010 noted the importance of students feeling safe as a major contributing factor to learning, as it allows them to concentrate on learning rather than their personal safety. Violence and fighting undermines this necessary perception of safety, resulting in a less productive learning environment. Alvarez and Bachman, 1997, noted that school violence increases students' anxiety and fear of school assaults. The ensuing paranoia can result in students choosing absenteeism as a coping mechanism. And as we all know, an absent student cannot learn necessary content if he is not in the class. The resulting diminished self-esteem can also result in students engaging in negative health behaviors, including drug and alcohol use, and even fighting themselves, which can result in suspensions, again causing them to lose out on vital learning time. A negative social life can stem from school violence as students erect barriers between themselves, classmates, friends, and family. The resulting feelings of worthlessness can demotivate students from learning or even attending school. Stress-related problems such as poor memory and concentration, sleep disturbance, and intrusive thoughts could be linked to the increased stress levels that children experience after exposure to violence.
And now we look at the sociological perspective. The sociological perspective allows us to question the functionalist approach, which has always been traditionally accepted. This approach helps us to understand the occurrences of school violence in underprivileged schools, the students that are involved in these incidences, and its impact on learning. It allows us the opportunity to examine educational issues such as school violence and student learning through the critical lens of the Marxist and interactionist theories. These theories encourage us to empathize with underprivileged students who would normally be blamed for fighting in schools at the expense of their education. As teachers, we have been brainwashed to approach education and its issues from a functionalist view. This view perceives the education system as being orderly, neutral, and objective, with meritocracy determining the placement of underprivileged students in low-performing schools where fighting may be rampant. It encourages us to be unsympathetic to underprivileged students as they outrightly blame students, the lack of resources due to poverty, or unproductive classroom environment for their underperformance. The Marxist view, however, allows us to criticize this established perception of schools and education. This view encourages educators to understand why fighting occurs mainly in underprivileged schools to eventually hinder what is traditionally considered to be learning. The Marxist view sensitizes us to the intentional disparity in teaching and learning between schools designed for students with a high economic status versus those with low social economic status. It criticizes the fact that schools, as agents of socialization, unfairly socialize students in the norms and expectations of the underprivileged communities that they come from. Therefore, Teachers themselves limit the amount of effort applied to truly ensuring that adequate learning takes place. It also allows teachers to understand that violent students are sometimes unwilling victims of their circumstance, as violence is the normal approach to solving conflict in their communities. The values associated with a peaceful educational environment to ensure learning takes place may therefore be non-existent for them. The interactionist view of education can sensitize teachers to how individuals from underprivileged communities actually make sense of education where it may not necessarily have much value to their reality. With this view, teachers can understand why students act out by fighting in the classroom, where their perceptions of the value of education conflicts with the teacher's value of education or the school's value of education. Hammersley 1997 noted that the interactionist view can help teachers understand how teacher perception of underprivileged students can negatively affect students' behavior and performance in class, causing them to act out by fighting. The irrelevance of the standardized content being taught in underprivileged schools can create a force fit, as there is no attempt to mutually negotiate what is important for the students to learn. This in itself is an impediment to student learning, as again, they tend to rebel against the system by fighting. Menard 2000 noted that social media has added another dimension to influencing already underprivileged, at-risk students as it glamorizes violence while easily influencing and desensitizing some students from underprivileged communities, where violence is the norm. Seeming lack of repercussions further encourages students to perpetuate violence in the school. Finally, the analysis of the impact of school violence and student learning, particularly from the Marxist and interactionist perspectives, should encourage us as teachers to understand the nature of some of our underprivileged students and go beyond the challenges to adapt our classroom management methods, pedagogical approaches, and to a large extent, curriculum content to meet these students' needs. Hopefully, in doing so, we can reduce the incidence of fights in the classroom to foster student learning.
Conclusion. Violence. The very word instills fear and anxiety to those who hear it. As teachers, we are faced daily with varying levels of violence in our schools. This assignment has certainly sensitized us to the importance of understanding how school violence negatively impacts student learning through various lenses. From a philosophical point of view, it is imperative that teachers stand together and uphold a common philosophy of education. This philosophy must be clear and unbiased to both parties. It should seek the interest of both perpetrators and victims. From a psychological point of view, we can now identify signs to prevent violence before it happens and also recognize and address the signs of trauma in the victims of such violence. The HFLE factors which surround and affect our young people are constantly evolving. As teachers, we must unite and demand that training in HFLE be conducted for new teachers and students alike. From a sociological perspective, we are now aware that we may have subconsciously subscribed to the traditional functionalist perspective. This is not fair to the students who are placed in underprivileged schools. We will now make a conscious effort to switch to the Marxist and interactionist perspectives to understand our children. Teachers must recognize 1. The signs of a child who lives in a home with
with violence. 2. That bullying is possibly a clue that the child is treated violently himself. And 3. That school violence can negatively affect students' learning.